Redux is an adjective meaning brought back or bringing back. Welcome to Makeshift Stories Redux, selected tales re-edited and re-recorded from the last 10 years of the podcast. Relax. Let the world go by and open your imagination as we drop back to April 12th, 2014 to listen to The Return of Dr. Plastic. Read by Ballto Kenney.
I was awake when the dog started barking at a ghost blown down the street on the lip of an early fall wind, which was gone by the time I stiffly staggered to the window. I settled her down, tempting her back to her favorite cushion with a piece of leftover chicken from the fridge. Then, giving in to my insomnia, made tea and poured myself into a chair in the dining room. Eventually, my eyes drifted over to a framed illustration hung on the wall beside the table. It consisted of 2 comic panels, rendered in a careless gestural style that was more suited to a first-year art school drawing class than a graphic novel. The caption in the upper right hand of the top panel read, "At the Gyre, somewhere in the Pacific, Dr. Plastic unleashes streams of polycarbonate debris mixed with his own secret sauce." Gyre was misspelt. In the bottom panel, a crudely drawn, desperate-looking Dr. Plastic laughed uncontrollably while he floated on an anti-gravity platform surrounded by hundreds of robotic minions. They all held fire hoses that were spewing tons of goop into the water, which instantly absorbed the plastic garbage trapped in the gyre to form a quickly spreading artificial island. There were 2 dialogue boxes over the supervillain's head. "Ha ha ha," the smaller one stated. Then the larger one continued, "The world doesn't think about throwing away its plastic garbage, and that will be its downfall. Look how my new empire grows. Soon, it will cover all the world's oceans, and no one can stop me. No one will even think to until it's too late." It was strange how one could acknowledge something without really looking at it for such a long time, I mused. Then remembered the night I met Dr. Plastic, a.k.a. Richard Smith, a.k.a. Rob Stepansky. We met in college when we were both taking a commercial art diploma. I was in graphic design, and Rob was in illustration. At the time, I lived in an old apartment facing out onto the rivers that divided the city into 3 distinct areas. I was lucky to share a unit that faced the riverbank with a separate entrance through the kitchen from a wooden staircase that clung precariously to the side of the old brick building. And that was the door Rob banged on, waking me at 2 a.m. on a work night. Back then, I was employed by a small ad agency as an art director, an hour's bus ride to get to, so a 2 a.m. visit was not very welcome. When I answered the insistent pounding, to the protests of my roommate, Rob burst through the door into the kitchen, hoisting a 2-4 of beer onto the table and dropping a thick rolled-up sheaf of paper secured with 2 elastics down beside it. He had been working on a remote northern rail cruise since the beginning of the spring, and it was his first few hours back in town. "I didn't expect you back here until October," I said with a consciously limited amount of enthusiasm, following him to our small kitchen table, indicating that he should keep his voice as low as possible. Ignoring my request, Rob pointed to the paper scroll and loudly proclaimed, "I drew them up north. We weren't close to any town, so I had lots of time at night. It's my new book, the one I started last winter." "I'm glad you've got so much done," I quietly encouraged, indicating with my hands that he needed to keep his voice down. Rob had been trying to publish a graphic novel ever since I had met him. It had been several years since college, and although he had completed 5 books and was now working on his 6th, the closest he had come to publishing was making a few photocopies and trying to sell them at craft fairs. Back then, Usenet only consisted of a few hundred academic computers, and the web was still over 10 years into the future. So, self-publishing consisted of exactly what Rob was doing, very small scale and hyper-local. Take a look, Rob encouraged. I reached over and carefully slipped the elastics off of the paper and unrolled the drawings. The top sheet, the one now hanging beside my dining room table, was signed from Robert. I put it to one side, and underneath, in Rob's loose style, was a cover for his new book. While I was doing this, Rob loudly rummaged through the kitchen cabinets. Finally locating a bottle opener, he popped the caps off of 2 beers and plunked them down on the table between us. "Thanks for the drawing, Rob," I said, flipping the cover over to reveal the sheet underneath. The first frame of the next page showed a frantic-looking character racing through an apartment, ripping down pictures, looking under furniture and lampshades. The caption read, "Disguised as Richard Smith, an ordinary cable TV installer, living in Central City, Dr. Plastic checks his apartment for listening devices." "How was your summer?" I tried asking to take control of the conversation. "Lots of flies and mosquitoes. Look." Rob rolled up one sleeve, revealing a well-chewed, recovering arm. "A short season this year, but it's still enough to qualify me for unemployment over the winter." I tried to think of something appropriate to say, but could only come up with a lame response. "That sounds great," although I knew it wasn't. There was a sad harmonic in his voice that said the annual descent into near-indentured labor each summer had its price. And in payment, he had to disgorge a part of his soul somewhere along the tracks in the bush, like a piece of discarded slag from an old steam engine. I kept to myself this year. I liked it when everyone finally went into town. Then I could get some peace, no one physically looking over my shoulder, if you know what I mean. I could work undisturbed if I kept the windows of the crew car shuttered. He tapped a calloused finger with a grease-stained nail on the unrolled stack of drawings. When did his hands change so much, I wondered? They used to be as delicate as a pianist. Rob continued. Around the beginning of June, I kept finding stuff in the bush only about 50 feet away from the tracks. Mostly tiny robotic eyes, disguised as flowers, very expensive tech, very hard to get. Something moved them every time we changed the location of the work camp. I don't know how they found me, but they tracked us the whole summer. I knew he wanted me to challenge him on this point, so could get right to that troubled place, but I didn't. I had hoped that several months away would have brought him around, allowing him to clear his mind and see things as they actually were. The clue that instead it had just festered away was the first frame of his new book. I changed the subject. Pulling the stack of drawings toward me, I asked, "Tell me about the new book. It looks almost finished," I added, thumbing through the pages. Rob enthusiastically brightened, grabbing the drawings away from me and placing the cover back on the stack, then pointed to the title. "It's called Escape to the Plastic Citadel. It's the final installment. Dr. Plastic reveals his true identity. Then he's forced to build his own fortress of solitude in the middle of the Pacific Ocean." Rob pulled a panel out of the stack. "I had no choice. After Dr. Plastic polluted the Great Lakes in Book 5 by stealing the world's supply of plastic microbeads, then resold them to the soap and cosmetic industry as a cheap exfoliating additive, the government got suspicious and started spying on him, trying to figure out whom his human alter ego was. Do you remember?" "It's been a while since I read it," I lied. I had only thumbed through Book 5 once on a late night when I couldn't go to sleep and there was nothing interesting to watch on our 12 channels of cable. It was called The Revenge of Dr. Plastic or something like that, right? "The Revenge of Micropolyethylene," Rob corrected with a hint of irritation in his voice. I almost apologized for my faulty memory, then realized that he was the one who had woken me up at 2 a.m. on a work night. So instead, I kept silent and impatiently waited for him to continue. I guess that I'll need to add a short version of the origin story at the front for some of my more casual readers," Rob mumbled, glaring in a way that made me feel I had deeply betrayed him. It will need to go something like this," he began. Dr. Plastic arrived on Earth by accident. In a desperate attempt to save their only son, his parents had sealed him into a life pod and shot it towards Saturn's moon, Titan, the closest cold planetary-sized object that had a hydrocarbon cycle similar to their own imperiled world. A colony of scientists was to follow him, but when their son went nova sooner than they had predicted, the shockwave from the explosion nudged their tiny fleet of escaping spacecraft off course. So they never arrived in Sol's system. Meanwhile, due to a mistake during the hasty preparations, the life pod's trajectory was ever so slightly miscalculated. As a result, 5,000 years later, when the hatch finally popped open, a young Ursunan boy found himself stranded in the middle of a crater melted into the Barnes ice cap on Baffin Island, tragically on a hot world covered with molten water. You can never imagine how painful it is to burn your hand on scorching hot water ice, especially for a young frightened boy who didn't know any better. Can you? Rob accused. I know what that's like. Anyway, after accidentally burning most of his skin on the water ice, the young Dr. Plastic returned to his tiny pod and put himself in hibernation while the ship's AI worked on the problem. The machine intelligence eventually decided to seal the young Ursunan in a permanent second skin of impregnable, heat-resistant plastic. Unconsciously, Rob pinched a bit of skin on his mosquito-bitten forearm, noticed what he was doing, then corrected his statement. Actually, he was sealed in a layer of artificial plastic-like skin that deflected the heat of this hot world. Invincibility would have been a good idea, but it's too late for that. You can't change what has already happened, right, Frank? Sure you can, I suggested hopefully. It happens all the time in fiction. You just need to add a few backstory panels to explain how that happened. Good idea, Rob said, staring at his arm again. The invincibility factor of the artificial skin was damaged by solar radiation. There was that big hole in the ozone over the Arctic, you know, so it makes sense. That's what probably happened. I should have thought of that. Thanks. Rob smiled thoughtfully. Book 1 only starts after Dr. Plastic left the Arctic and was building his alter ego, Rick Smith, as he attended community college, so there's a little bit of wiggle room in the origin story, but only a bit. I don't want to stray too far from the facts. My sleep-starved mind finally began to come alive, then I started to remember. The first book was the only one in the series I had completely read. Rob had been in a better state of mind back then, until a failed attempt to date one of our former classmates hurled him into a manic state. After that, he created Dr. Plastic. At the time, I thought it would be a good focus for him. He needed something positive in his life. His drawing style was making it hard for him to find a job, and graphic novels from Japan were just starting to edge into North American consciousness, their visual style the antithesis of what Rob was doing. Yeah, I remember now, I quietly chirped, hinting again that Rob needed to keep his voice down. Dr. Plastic used the college electronics lab to build a time machine, but instead of sending him back in time and space so he could correct the navigation error that sent him to Earth, the machine only kicked him back 50 years. So he made the best of the situation and decided to steal the patent on plastic wrapping, then returned to the late 1970s, where he started the Great Packing Material Wars. He helped plastic eventually win out, displacing cardboard and paper and making him fabulously wealthy in the process. I smiled, proud of myself for remembering. That's when the environmental groups got into the game, Rob groused. They wanted to figure out who he started to say before correcting himself, who Dr. Plastic's alter ego was, so they could take him to court and sue him. And that's why he needed a disguise, and it worked for such a long time, too. Who would suspect a semi-employed cable TV installer living in a bachelor apartment in the north end of Central City? And it almost worked up until recently. He looked glum again. Those devices in the forest. I found this summer. Not wanting him to stray back to the dark side of paranoia, I cut Rob off, directing the conversation back to Book 6. Tell me more about the new story. Well, he began, it's important to understand first that Dr. Plastic was never understood. Plastic was a naturally occurring material on his native hydrocarbon-saturated world, where the mountains were capped with polystyrene snow which accumulates from the heavy petrochemical rains. So what was the problem with making plastic? Nothing. It's as natural as dirt. And it's beautiful. To him, anyway. Covering the world with it would be something, well, like replanting a forest on Earth. So Dr. Plastic never understood the resistance to his work and why the world cast him as a villain. No one understands, he repeated. Not even now. Dr. Plastic is still shunned and despised for just being himself, an alien. Plastic microbeads suspended in water. Rob mused nervously, fingering his stack of drawings. Did you know that when the sun shines through them, they refract light into the most beautiful underwater rainbows? The scientists never bothered to look at it like that. They just dissected a few fish in the Great Lakes and started to freak out when they found plastic beads. And that's when governments took notice and started to spy on anyone who they even remotely suspected is connected to Dr. Plastic. They've intensified the hunt for his alter ego. Think what that is like, Frank. With both environmental groups and the government hot on your trail, like cyborg bloodhounds that won't give up. Things are getting pretty tough, and tough times spawn desperate acts, and that's where it starts. Rob stopped to take a swig of his beer, emptying the bottle. He had that focused look in his eyes, which said at that moment nothing existed beyond the reality that he was describing. It was a look I had hoped I'd never see again. Unaware of my growing discomfort, Rob forged ahead. Yeah, so in Book 6, well, it's time. Time to get out of here. Time to escape to somewhere no one really cares about, to finally build a new world where life is kinder and that sort of thing, where only people who understand and appreciate the sublime elegance of polycarbonates will be allowed. So, I figured, if you can't get off the planet, where would the best place be? The Great Pacific Gyre, of course, where all the carelessly abandoned plastic eventually ends up. It's the perfect place. And do you know the crazy thing about it? He didn't wait for an answer. The crazy thing is that while the world treats Dr. Plastic like a criminal, everyone just chucks their plastic bags and bottles into the ocean, then blames him when there are fish that are full of it. What do they expect? Rob dropped his voice into a deep baritone. However much they vilify me, they're doing my bidding anyway, building my citadel of plastic one carelessly discarded bottle and bag at a time. And all I have to do is enhance the process a bit by adding a pre-programmed assembler molecule to the mix. Rob laughed and pulled a sheet from the middle of the stack. I stared at it. He had recited the caption word for word without looking at the panel. A shiver ran up my spine. I hadn't seen him so obsessed since the time I had to talk him out of going after a mutual friend, whom Rob claimed was following him around. It's out there, growing right now, Frank. Imagine an empire of polyethylene constantly growing. 80 million tons of it are made and dumped every year. That's 219,000 tons a day, or 152 tons every minute. It just grows and grows, and it will be too late by the time someone finally figures it out. In the meantime, they'll waste their time hunting for the poor doctor's alter ego. It's a fabulous plot and a great plan. Dr. Plastic stops hiding behind Richard Smith, and then the world finally knows the face of its new master. Rob pulled another page out and turned it for me to see. It showed a silhouetted figure standing on a mountain of discarded plastic, hands on hips, a cape billowing behind in the breeze with the caption, "Out from the shadows at last. Dr. Plastic finally reveals himself." A cape? Really? Chose a cape? I questioned, barely containing a laugh. Looking hurt, Rob snarled, "Come on! Superheroes can have a cape. There's no rule against that. And it's made from flexible, bulletproof polycarbonates. I've always wanted one." For a second, I thought he was going to pull a cape out of his backpack. And so it went, the late night progressing to early morning as Rob explained the new book, mixing his own life with his fictional creation, until the two started to become one. And me? I tried to keep him from sliding back into the dark pit of paranoia he had fallen into over the last few years, filled with delusions of persecution, TV sets that watched him, walls with ears and phones that tracked his every step. It was almost 5 in the morning when my patience finally gave up and went back to bed, leaving me to fend for myself. "Rob!" I blurted out. "Stop. Obviously, going back north this summer didn't help. I was hoping that getting away from the depressing room you were living in would reset things for you. There was no one spying on you last winter, and no one in the bush this summer. That guy we both went to college with, the one you claimed had moved in down the hall from you, the one you said insinuated his way into your place to plant bugs, remember? You told me about it last March. Well, I met him while you were away. He can barely recall you. Rob, you need to see someone about this. I've tried, but this is beyond me and beyond you. You need to get help. You, Frank of all people, should understand," Rob barked. He quickly gathered his drawings and roughly rolled them up, considered using them as a club to sweep the empty bottles off of the table, then reconsidered and slipped the roll into his coat pocket, then stood up. He was barely under control, and for the first time I felt physically threatened by him. Rob was at least a head taller and had 50 pounds on me. He just stood there, and in a deep, trembling voice screamed, "They've gotten to you too, haven't they? There's a camera or mic around here, isn't there? They've recorded everything I've said and know who I really am, and thanks to you, now know what I'm gonna do next. You've betrayed me." Rob turned suddenly, bumping chairs over and headed for the door, slamming it behind him and climbing down the wooden stairs, so noisily I heard angry bangs of protest from the neighbors below. I sat there, stunned and relieved, but feeling guilty that I had not done enough to help him, that, indeed, I had failed him. I didn't talk to Rob again after that night, but occasionally heard bits and pieces through the odd person that would run across him at a public market or outside a mall, flogging his graphic novels. And I even thought I saw him once on the other side of a busy street, barely recognizable through an overgrown beard. His unmistakable loping gait gave him away. One shoulder sagged under the weight of a heavy canvas bag, marked with the faded logo of a defunct local newspaper. I like to imagine that the bag was full of copies of Dr. Plastic. Eventually, lured by new opportunities, I moved away from Central City and hadn't really thought about Rob or Dr. Plastic until now. Curious, I pulled my tablet out from under a stack of flyers, then turned it on. The plastic and glass slab obediently jumped to life, bathing my face in the cold, precise light of millions of tiny LCDs. I tapped open a browser and thumb-typed into the address bar between 2 quotation marks, Dr. Plastic. After plodding through dozens of pages of results of plastic surgeons, liposuctions, and lawsuits for the proceeding, I found nothing. Disappointed, I was about to close the browser when I decided to take the search engine's advice, results for Dr. Plastic without quotation marks, and immediately found a 4-year-old news story titled, Japanese Fishermen Find Mysterious Object in Pacific Gyre. 5 Japanese fishermen who were blown off course by a late-season typhoon claim to have spotted an enormous building shrouded in mist floating on the water at the center of the plastic debris in the Great Pacific Gyre. They claim their attempts to investigate were thwarted by a mysterious current. The dog, which had apparently only been pretending to sleep, suddenly barked, jumping out of her seat, pasting her nose to the patio doors facing the front street, fogging the glass with her excited snorts. This time, I managed to get to the window fast enough to just catch a glimpse of a shadow, with what looked like a cape, flit out of sight chased by 2 plastic grocery bags and the faint sound of rustling polyethylene. "He's back, Annie," I whispered to my dog, calming her with a scratch behind the ears.
Redux is a Makeshift Stories production. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB Financial. To listen to other great APN podcasts, such as the award-winning Bothy Story Telling Podcast, please head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com. This episode was brought to you by Park Power, a provider of electricity and natural gas in Alberta that offers low rates, awesome service, and profit sharing with local charities. In Alberta, you get to choose who you buy your energy from. Park Power has low overhead, and chances are you'll save money if you switch. You can find out how much money you would save by visiting parkpower.ca and plug in your numbers into the Alberta Energy Savings Calculator. If you decide to switch, it's easy. Nothing changes about your service, only the price you pay. Learn more at parkpower.ca. Makeshift Stories is released twice a month around the 1st and the 15th. This month's story was written by Hare and read by Ballto Kenney. The opening and closing music was composed and recorded by David Hume. If you'd like to connect with us or have other episodes you'd like us to re-release, please send us an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at Makeshift Stories. You can help us out by telling your friends about us and getting them to head over to Apple Podcasts and subscribe. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivative license, which means you're free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.